Winning the Second World War was a big sacrifice for the United Kingdom. In fighting off the Nazis, especially up until 1941, when the Americans finally came into the war and started to help us, we had been basically going into debt with the United States of America. To fight that war and to win that war, the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, to give it its proper title, lost its empire. And so by the end of the Second World War, we found ourselves with no money. Rationing was still in place. Most people living in cities were living on top of a bomb site. And it was difficult times in the end of the 1940s for the people in the United Kingdom. The thing that really got them through, I think, was the appointment of the Attlee government, probably the greatest government in British history, that brought in all sorts of benefits, the National Health Service, and a whole bunch of other things that enabled those people that were at the bottom of the pile to get through it. By the time we get to the 1950s, the burst in affluence that often comes in after a great war was finally starting to happen. My parents were that generation. My dad was born in 1938 and my mum was born in 1940. When rock and roll hit in 1956, my mum was 16 and my dad was 18. My dad didn't fall for rock and roll. He was too interested in listening to his modern jazz, Dave Brubeck and Stan Kenton. But my mum enjoyed rock and roll and she bought records by Little Richard and she bought records by Buddy Holly and a whole host of people. Whilst this was happening, the United Kingdom created its sort of homegrown version of rock and roll, which was skiffle. Skiffle came to prominence when Lonnie Donegan went to number one in the charts with these cover versions of an old Leadbelly tune, or if Leadbelly wrote it, but Leadbelly had made it famous in the 1940s, and he covered Rock Island Line. This started a craze called skiffle. And skiffle emerged in the 50s, and basically this was a way that people that had been basically knocked back and depleted by the Second World War could find enjoyment in forming bands and playing music, which is a very communal thing. And the reason why this was so groundbreaking is the songs were relatively simple, but they were lively, they were groovy, they sang songs about being at the bottom of the pile, and you didn't have to be a virtuoso musician to play them or even own an instrument. If you could get together a old guitar, maybe a washboard and a broom handle, or maybe one of those things that a washboard, I just said it, a washboard. I'm into tea chests. So a lot of the instruments in skiffle were made out of household objects. This spawned a whole bunch of musicians, and those around London, people like Jeff Beck and the Beatles and Jimmy Page. Beatles weren't around there, they were up in Liverpool. Now, Liverpool was an interesting place to be at that time because you could get the records, because those boats were coming in. It was a port city. It was like New Orleans. Boats would come in, and on those boats there would be sailors, and those sailors would bring in records. And so people in Liverpool got to hear these old rhythm and blues and rock and roll records. Down in London, being a sort of more cosmopolitan place, you had the music industry, and this brought in a whole bunch of newer musicians who then went to work in the huge session scene that existed in London at that time, but informed by skiffle and later on rhythm and blues, and then the blues. There was a huge blues boom here in the UK in the 1960s. And that combined with the fact that we got electric guitars with Marshall amps, and the Marshall amps could be overdriven, we suddenly have this heavy guitar sound being applied to American Chicago blues. Now, all that electric blues sound had already been pioneered in America. Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Buddy Guy and Freddie King and B.B. King. They'd done it already. They'd been distorting guitars. They'd been turning the guitars and playing like screaming guitars. You know, they'd done it all already. And these albums were lapped up by British people. Now, the subject of this video is, I'm asking the question, is rock music cultural appropriation? Because at that point in time, white British young men became enamored with the blues and they started to try and play it as authentically as they possibly could, following on from people like Cyril Davis and Alexis Corner that had gone before. The Beatles were also aping American rhythm and blues. They were trying to sound like Little Richard, and they were trying to sound like Chuck Berry. And once they took their sort of Liverpudlian British version of American rhythm and blues back to America, they became the biggest band on the planet, and that brought a focus onto the United Kingdom. Before the Beatles came along, it was a rarity for a British artist to be able to hit the American charts. I think the first American #1 by a British musician was a sort of light opera song by, what was his name? David Whitfield. So we did have those artists there, and we did make dents. You know, there was the fact that the British music scene, sharing a common language with America, was able to put music into their charts, but the Beatles took it over. Before you knew it, if you looked at the American charts, the first slot, the second slot, the third slot, the fourth slot were all taken up by the Beatles. And this opened up a sort of coolness in America about being British. They wanted British artists, but what the British artists were doing was aping their American blues, which had really come out of the black communities in the United States of America. I felt that there's two problems here with this. First is an artistic problem. Can a British, white, usually middle class gentleman play the blues? And if they do that, how does that work? Is that then become part of their cultural makeup? Is it a part of their cultural background? Because the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and Cream are all British, and in many ways they wore their Britishness on their sleeve. Of course, the real genius of that period was Jimi Hendrix, and Jimi Hendrix seemed to be the direct amalgamation of genuine American black rhythm and blues with this English aesthetic, with two musicians, Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell, you know, who were bringing their own influences in, you know, especially with Mitch Mitchell, who was really trying to play like people like Tony Williams or Elvin Jones, but he was trying to play like that within this sort of power trio context. I found this very interesting. Not only were they influenced by it, but they played the songs. And so rock music is basically the British version of the blues, played with electric instruments. And a certain dynamic comes from jazz as well into that, where there's this idea to want to free express yourself in a sort of modal way, which is coming from people like Coltrane and Miles Davis, but without the vocabulary of jazz. So you don't need that. You can use the vocabulary of blues, but open it up. One of the things that the British blues bands did is they soloed for a long, long time. You know, obviously Freddie Green and B.B. King would take solos, but nothing like Cream was doing, and not with a rhythm section acting in that way. This is a fascinating change. And it's within that, as we have explained so many times on this channel, within that is the place where rock music is born, and rock and roll and pop music become rock music, right? Or a great part is played by that scene. And I think especially when you start to look at heavy rock, although America, of course, had its MC5s, and it had its Steppenwolfs, and it had its Iron Butterflies, the idea of heavy music and that becoming world dominating is your Led Zeppelins and your Black Sabbaths and your Deep Purples. And so for someone like myself who is here talking to you because of that type of rock music, I always thought it's fascinating that nobody at the time thought that was strange that a young man from West Bromwich could be singing about the levee breaking, that didn't seem strange. There is so much in those songs that white British people are singing that seem to be strange. Now, if we were to look at this, and I don't suggest you do this, but if you were to look at this through the lens of identity politics, you could also accuse this of cultural appropriation. Now, apparently, cultural appropriation has a whole bunch of rules to it. Some people say you can appropriate someone's culture as long as you don't exploit it. In the case of these blues bands, so many of them were either adapting old black blues tunes or wholesale, performing them again and saying that they had written them. They were becoming multimillionaires, and all these British rock musicians by the mid-70s were living in their huge castles, living like little princes, all right? And they had done it off the back of these blues songs that in many cases, these people were either dead, or if they were around, they were seriously having financial trouble, because in America at the same time, the black community who were arguing and championing for civil rights turned their back a little bit on the blues. They were much more interested in the positive sound of Motown and soul, or James Brown saying, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." They didn't want to go back to this sort of music of melancholy, the music that had been produced by subjugation, and lyrics that explored the desperation of being at the bottom of the pile. And in that, it does seem quite strange that, white British middle class people could feel that they could sing those lyrics. That they could sing about, the Rock Island Line, they could sing about, working on a chain gang, that they could sing these things and it was sort of okay. And often I wonder what was the actual impetus at the time culturally for people to accept this. And I think what was happening at the time is that generation had come up after the Second World War, and it was that boomer generation, the ones that were born at the time of war, that had grown up in the pocket of that war, and their early years had been spent in a quite black and white grey area. And then Elvis Presley and Little Richard emerged in the 1950s, and they'd all gone to see The Girl Can't Help It or Blackboard Jungle or whatever it is. And suddenly their lives turned into Technicolor. And so they saw some sort of route out of their experience. Not the same route that black people had to do to get out of their experience in America, but a different route out altogether. And I think they utilised that music to basically sing about things which the generation above would have thought were unfit to sing about. Of course, Bob Dylan out in the States, he takes the folk forms of America and the blues forms of America, he takes the songs of Lead Belly, songs of Charlie Patton, and he puts a spin on it which actually voices this feeling that is amongst the youth of that time. The youth want to create a utopia, and they believe that utopia will be created by everybody coming together, everybody having an equal voice. Now, I think that a lot of those ideas that emerged in the 1960s have atrophied as we get to this point in time, and now they are falling to bits. But fundamentally, underneath it, I am an old hippie. And this idea of finding common ground and an idea of finding a voice and being able to explore this and find the universal humanity of art and music, I think is still the goal we need to aim at. And so it's quite interesting to me that you could, if you were arguing it from a modern identitarian point of view, turn around and say people like Led Zeppelin and people like Cream, those groups were just ripping off black blues artists from America. They never got recompense, but even when they did eventually get recompense, it just still shows up the racist situation that when the black musicians were doing it, they didn't have the success. And so as the white musicians started to do it, they did, and they became multi-millionaires. And as much as it's dripped down to the black community, in the end, it still shows up the inherent racism that exists. So I can make that argument myself. But for me, I have always been troubled by two things. One is the idea of British popular music utilising black American aesthetics, and for that to actually chime in a truthful way with what British musicians are doing. Now, I think this was quite apparent. If we look at the blues bands that were emerging by the late 60s, You know, you've got bands like Free and you've got bands like Fleetwood Mac. But Fleetwood Mac, eventually they're drawn back to America. And by the time they have, you know, Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks come in, they've brought in aspects of, you know, Crosby, Stills and Nash, American folk music, American middle of their own music, Americana, and they are almost like existing like an American band, or at least a cosmopolitan American band. So it's interesting to look at the blues bands that emerge in the end of the 60s here in the UK and see what happens to them. Some of them become blues, you know. Some people who are playing very British music, like Robin Trower, you know, in Procol Harum, turned to Hendrix, and by the mid-70s, they are, you know, have one of the great blues power trios in the history of rock and roll, as far as I'm concerned. But actually, when you look at what happens, Led Zeppelin eventually on Led Zeppelin 3, they sort of go off into the Welsh countryside, and they draw in this aesthetic that comes from the countryside. They also bring in aesthetic from the English countryside. And before you know it, they're playing blues tunes like When the Levee Breaks, but they have gone beyond it and they've moved it into something else. But it still seems quite strange to listen to what Robert Plant is singing on When the Levee Breaks. It seems quite strange that he's singing that to me. It always has. Bands like Pink Floyd and Jethro Tull, they start to explore the English heritage, and they bring in things that come from the literary tradition. They look at sort of more classical ways of arranging music, more folk-based classical folk chord progressions, and also they combine that with Dylan's idea of busting out of just singing songs about love and relationships and going out and having a good time. They start to sing about other subjects, and where Dylan could be seen as a sort of the voice of that generation, a lot of the British bands start to explore sort of almost like English mysticism, English esotericism. And that is really where progressive rock is born. Progressive rock is not just music, which is quite complex and doesn't sound like normal rock, as Frank Zappa once said. You know, progressive rock essentially is rock music that's infused with an English aesthetic. This is why some of the European bands like Magma and Can don't really sound like progressive rock and sound like much more like avant-garde experimental rock music, and seem much closer to the aesthetics that we see post-punk emerging in rock music. Now, the progressive rock bands of the early 70s really dealt with the issue. And I would say that infusion of the blues, right, that British rock bands did a very good job of, once that had become a big success, once Cream emerged, once Hendrix emerged, they are very successful in taking that aesthetic and moulding it into something that becomes uniquely British. Right, but there is a much more interesting place where I think this happens even more so and more successfully, and it happens so successfully that the artsy-fartsy types of the music historians didn't notice it. In that burgeoning music scene in the 60s, there's a whole bunch of different musicians. You could track them through. Often if you look at sessions on a Burt Bacharach record and look at the people who are playing on that and then see where they went on, it's almost like a who's who of people who are going to go and shape the foundations of rock music in the 1970s. There were two musicians working in that world, and the one was called David Peacock, who was a guitarist and bass player, played a little bit of banjo and stuff like that, and the other one was a pianist called Chas Hodgetts. And these were sort of stalwarts on that post rhythm and blues boom, progressive rock session scene. And we were involved in all sorts of progressive rock bands. They also played on British rhythm and blues tracks, soul tracks, all sorts of different tracks. But I think those two guys were also grappling, thinking, how do we take this music that we grew up loving, and how do we embody that into something that really does represent our culture? And with Chas Hodgetts and Dave Peacock, they basically went back to the music that they first loved, which was rock and roll. And they really went back to that sort of barrel house style of Jerry Lee Lewis, piano, bass and drums. You know, goodness gracious, great balls of all that type of stuff. But they married this with the sound of sort of Cockney knees up music that you would hear in a pub, which have been sung in pubs for many years, and sort of have their roots in sort of British musical. It's low art, it's working class art. You know, I've got a lovely bunch of coconuts. Well, I have, and if you don't know that song, you probably think, why did Andy just say that randomly? But I've got a lovely bunch of coconuts. It's a song that I have known since I was first born. It's like a British hymn, right? And it comes from the musical, and it goes like this. I've got a lovely bunch of coconuts. Here they are, all standing in the road. Big ones, small ones, some as big as your head. And I can't remember the rest of it. Now, the reason why I bring this up and what inspired this video is not my love for Chas and Dave, although that is underlying basically what you're going to get. This is a video about Chas and Dave. I've done one before and I'm doing another one again. I'm going to champion Chas and Dave every now and then, but actually I managed to pick up a copy of Dirt Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, or Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap to be more accurate, by AC/DC, and I've had it in the car. And as a side chat, because this is something else I wanted to talk about, and I'll talk about it here, AC/DC do take some time to get going. Those first Australian albums, like the Australian High Voltage, and then you got TNT, all right, it's very patchy. By the time they then pull all the best tracks together and put it together onto an album, which is the American High Voltage, I still don't think they're quite there. And what's interesting is that AC/DC are an out-and-out rock and roll band. They're probably the most rock and roll band of all rock and roll bands. Everything they are doing, exactly like every other band we're talking about, is drawing from American black rhythm and blues. There would be no AC/DC without Chuck Berry. Angus Young is like a schoolboy version of Chuck Berry. You know, all the moves are there, the stage show and everything. You know, which then has its roots in T-Bone Walker and goes right back to sort of vaudeville. It goes back to even minstrelsy. All that's coming through. But it lands in AC/DC. And of course, AC/DC, you know, the Young Brothers are actually originally from the UK. Brian Johnson has had his times in the UK. The older Young and Vander production team, which they were related to, have their roots into British music. When they bring Brian Johnson in a later date, he also is a Scottish gentleman. So, or Newcastle, actually. I do apologise, Brian. I'm not too sure. I'm just going on his accent, but if that's his accent, he's from Newcastle. Aye, Petal. He's from Newcastle, isn't he, old Brian? Now, they have their Australian version of rock and roll, which is different to a British version. It is actually much dirtier and it's much more lowbrow, which I like. I really am starting to think that we have made intelligent rock music too much. And now it's all got into the past. We're all sitting here trying to elevate it to the level of Shakespeare, when it's way better than Shakespeare. Anyway, I put on Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, which I think is still patchy. It's much better. They're on Atlantic Records now, but it's still patchy. The title track, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, is great. Problem Child is absolutely top-notch AC/DC. Does all the stuff I love about AC/DC, but of course that also appears on Let There Be Rock, which is a masterpiece. On the album is a tune called Big Balls. And Big Balls is a tune about how Brian Johnson, surprisingly, you wouldn't expect this, but he owns a stately home. In there, he puts on balls. And these balls, he's basically having a boast about his balls. And he likes all sorts of balls. Some people have small balls, some people have medium-sized balls, but he has big balls. They're the balls he likes the best. You know, some balls they are for charity, some balls for fancy dress. But the balls that I love most, I can't remember the lyrics. Sorry, this is rubbish. I cannot believe I thought I would be able to pull this on, because again, this song is wired into my system. I can remember being told about it at school before I heard it. And I thought, surely not a rock band wouldn't sing a song like this, you know. But they did. Now, this really struck me very heavily in the difference between Australian culture and British culture. Is I spent some time in Australia around about 1995, which is now 30 years ago. That's the surprising thing. And at some point on a boring afternoon, because it was never boring in Australia, so much to do, we decided to go ice skating. And I'm not very good at ice skating, but I was doing my best. And I was skating around this ice rink in Australia, enjoying myself, whilst they played, and it was the most Australian thing you could have, Dirty Deeds Done Cheap. Whoever was in there, whichever the lads that were in there, they'd taken hold of it. There's kids skating around, and at some point, track 3 or track 4, wherever it comes on, big balls came out, and I can remember skating around, trying to not fall over, and skating to the sort of, chunky groove, slow 6/8 blues of big balls. And I thought, this is interesting. And it suddenly struck me that this is low folk, working class humour. This is musical. This is I've Got a Lovely Bunch of Coconuts. This is Swimming in the Women, George Formby. Australia has that, and they have it in a rawer form because, of course, Australians, being, the descendants of convicts, are much more common than us British people. I'm joking, sorry. I'm so sorry, Australian people. I've got family in Australia. I have to now make it up. Some of you laughed then at that point. It was a joke. Of course, they're not common in Australia. So, and that's what you hear with AC/DC. That's what we love about AC/DC, isn't it? That's what we love. Well, for me, there is no equivalent of AC/DC in the UK. Yeah, sure, Free are doing a lot of the stuff that AC/DC did later on. They ripped off by Fleetwood Mac on Highway to Hell. Can't remember which track it is. Which one's that? I can't remember. Anyway, I've sung it and you can put it in the comments. It's interactive, doesn't it? A bit of involvement from you all. You always enjoy that. And so, my equivalent, I think, of AC/DC, which is where you've taken American rhythm and blues, rock and roll, you've taken Chuck Berry, you've taken Jerry Lewis, and then you infuse it with this real Australian working class sense of humour. I mean, on Dirty Deeds Are Done Cheap, there's another song where Bon Scott sings, and the title of the song is this, Love at First Feel. And all the way through this, he is taking sort of cliche words, lyrics, phrases, and swapping them out so they have a much more sort of double entendre. He loves a double entendre, Bon Scott does. What a great man he was. And I respect this immensely. This is how I like my rock and roll. But of course, then you go back to Little Richard and you listen to Tutti Frutti and you realise what he's singing about is far more ruder than Big Balls by AC/DC. Now, Chaz Hodgetts and Dave Peacock, they form a duo called Chaz and Dave with this bloke on drums who's got a trilby hat on, but he's actually a very good drummer and I enjoy his drumming very much, and is a proper drummer that's listened to all the cool funk and soul and jazz drummers that can nail it, and he's doing his thing. There's a drummer in there, and basically they are playing really dirty, gutsy Jerry Lee Lewis piano stomping rhythm and blues. And by subfusing that with a sort of English working class knees up, which comes from the musical songs, you get basically the invention of what is probably the only truly British rock music. And what I mean by that is something which is wholeheartedly British, where you never feel, oh, that sounds like a bit like Freddie King, and I'm not too sure what are they singing about that for. You don't have that with Chaz and Dave. And so I've always thought, in terms of popular music, in terms of rock and roll, in terms of rock music, Chaz and Dave, it's absolutely perfect in what they achieve. Some of you Americans might not know who Chaz and Dave is. And the reason is because there's no way that was going to travel to your country. You have to be British to understand Chaz and Dave. And that's my point. Led Zeppelin, they could go to America because they as we say in this country, they were bringing coals to Newcastle. And so, once the Beatles had happened, the Americans, for some reason, loved their music being brought back to them, but being played by very posh sort of English gentlemen prancing around like little princes. This is what they loved. They loved it, especially the ladies. The ladies loved it as well. And once you have the ladies on side, you've got something to success. You have to get the ladies on side, right? And Chas and David, I don't think they ever got the ladies on side. So they didn't get the ladies on side. And also, they never created something that could travel back, even though they're playing rhythm and blues, because their songs, which are about, Rabbit is a favourite song of theirs, probably their most favourite song. And Rabbit is it's like dexterous in the same way rap and hip hop is. And at one point, they do this telescopic thing back and forward, rabbit, rabbit, rabbit. So everyone knows this in the UK. Rabbit is like a sort of Londoner phrase for someone talking. So if you're rabbiting too much, it means you're talking. Now, that is Cockney rhyming slang, rabbit. I don't know. For those who don't know what Cockney rhyming slang is that if you get a word like stairs, then you take a phrase where the second word rhymes with it. So you go apples and pears, and then you just use the word apples. People think that the Cockney for stairs is apples and pears, and it is. But you go take it with the old apples. That is what you would say, I think. I am not a Cockney. I might have got it wrong. My wife grew up in London for a certain amount of time, and she has this much more in her genes. And we have had many chats about Cockney rhyming slang. And some of them are very entertaining. For example, there was an actor in the 70s that played, he appeared in a Nescafe advert, coffee advert, and he was also in the New Avengers, right? And if you don't like somebody and you don't want to call them a naughty word, you could use his name in Cockney rhyming slang to say that bloke's a bit of a Gareth, because his name was Gareth Hunt. A bit of a Gareth, that bloke. Even ruder one is it's the name for a certain part of anatomy on a human being, and it's named after what that anatomy does. And this is probably the most offensive one. I'm not going to say it. As I was approaching it for comedy value. There I'm approaching it. No, let's just back off that. But those of you who know it will know it. So this is it. And so Chas and Dave brought all those things. And the thing is that if I put many of the hits that Chas and Dave have, I've only got the greatest hits of Chas and Dave on CD, but I enjoy it very much in the same way as I enjoy George Formby's greatest hits. It's another album I've grown up with and love very much. And this is an anomaly in my liking. Here we are talking about the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Miles Davis. We talked about Led Zeppelin and Yes and Genesis and Magma, and I don't talk about Magma that much. I wish I could, and you're probably wanting me to talk about Magma, and you're thinking, is Andy going to talk about Magma? No, he's on there talking about Chas and Dave, and all the Americans and Europeans go, oh, it's Chas and Dave, we've never even heard of them. But I wanted to put it out there, and I wanted to say that in the end, right, Chas and Dave do solve the artistic problem for me of how to integrate American rhythm and blues and soul and all that music into a British form. The progressive rockers did this as well, but they did it by actually moving slowly away from progressive rock. And that was what killed progressive rock. And when people got back into punk, one of the things that's interesting about punk is punk's rock and roll. Punk's visceral, but it's rock and roll with the heartiness and soul of the blues aspect of rock and roll taken away, right? That's a very interesting thing as well. And I think their ability to take that out was because they actually were influenced by progressive rock bands. And so they were able to see how the progressive rock bands had actually de-bluesified rock and roll. And so that is really also apparent in some of the art rock bands and then some of the glam bands that emerge, which I think is really what punk grows out of. It's coming out of David Bowie, it's coming out of Sweet, it's coming out of the bloke I was about to say, whose Cockney rhyming words rhymes with the part of your anatomy that's, you know, it's all there in the background. Every one of my videos has to have an esoteric meaning. That's all I can say. And I promise you there will be another, and this is dark esoteric meaning here. This is stuff you don't want to get into. So I think I'm at the end of this video now. I've said what I wanted to say about it. I've talked about it. Now, is it culture appropriation? Well, yeah, of course it is. One culture has appropriated another culture. Did it exploit that culture? Well, yeah, it did. Is that a bad thing? Suppose.
I see trees of green, red lotus too. I see the moon from me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Let me explain the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. What exactly is cultural appropriation?
A quick search tells you the adoption or use of elements of one culture by members of a different culture. But there is a blurred line between appreciation and appropriation. Like when you're jamming out in a Native American headdress just because it looks cool, that's appropriation. It happens in music, in fashion, and in movies and TV. Oh, and just a reminder, blackface is never okay.
Really?
They must be crackers.
I can't breathe. 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 I can't breathe.
And now, all of a sudden, I am in what I would call the English aesthetic, and I'm enjoying it. It's a lovely sunny day. There's some kids in a distant school playing some sort of football game type of thing. The birds are singing in the distance. There's a light rustle of wind in the trees. And I think the whole problem with the idea of cultural appropriation is not really understanding what culture is, or the limitation of saying that something is appropriate, as in that you have appropriated it. But that word appropriate is interesting to me. So I think that every part of culture has been appropriated in some way, shape or form. And I think we're all human beings, and the things that we create which are important culturally to a specific culture are important because they actually have a universal aspect to them, and they have an ability to be able to portray something which is universally human. If American sort of Delta blues had not sung songs that other people from other countries could understand, if it was entirely a black cultural form and that only spoke that people that lived in the 1890s or the early part of the 20th century in Southern America would understand, then its cultural value wouldn't actually be that important. And there is so much in culture which is ephemeral like that. The things that last are the things that have a deep resonance to us all. And sometimes to see someone from another culture responding, you know, putting something out there and then us responding in a way where it resonates. It's really interesting. Simon Sharma, the great British historian, made a TV series 20 years or so ago where he looked at the history of Britain, and the very first thing he looked at was a Roman encampment. So to start off with, he wasn't dealing with a British culture, he was dealing with Roman culture. And he found these letters that had been dropped, they'd been scraped onto some sort of clay, I think. There was some way that these little messages had been preserved. And he pulled something up, and it was quite normal, and it was actually quite offensive. And these people were chatting about a certain woman and how she had loose morals. I think I've got that right. The thing that struck me was the very fact that what they were talking about is what we talk about now. So you go all the way back to that period in time, and what fascinates us is the fact that the ancient Romans in ancient Rome, this culture that came in and completely changed the makeup of the United Kingdom, were actually people just like us who said things like that. And this is really starting to make me think about the ideas of low art and high art, and how that is really a product of the industrialization of art, you know, the sort of globalization of art in the 20th century, to make money. And now that has collapsed, and now art has been democratized by social networking, we're starting to see the limitations of that, this division between high art and low art. It seems silly. And so I would say that the things that really determine us culturally, that are our culture, is the natural things. This is what I feel is the English aesthetic. It starts with the English countryside. That's where it starts for me. It's in the landscape. But I believe that that landscape in itself is also able to be appreciated by people all over the world. And there may be people in other countries watching this, and they quite enjoy the fact that I'm sat here in England, and they can hear the sort of English chatter going on, and they might find that quite attractive to them. In the same way as if I was seeing someone just talking in their normal life, saying Buenos Aires, or maybe in you know, India or wherever it is, that I would find the culture that they're in very evocative, but evocative in a different way to this culture. So I think we have to really re-examine culture. We have to be proud of our own cultures. We have to support them. We have to support other people's cultures, and we have to understand that these cultures are all a product of things mixing and matching. Now, this is the basis of multiculturalism. This is what it is. So why does it seem that multiculturalism has gone so wrong? And what it is this the idea of cultural appropriation, and the idea of trying to keep something pure, trying to keep something hyper-moral, trying to keep something on that straight line. It's the straight line that I'm talking about. You know, that this is the proper way of doing it, and this needs to be preserved. It should only be preserved in that it is naturally preserved, because everybody understands the deep universal aspects of that culture. That is what I think. So is rock music cultural appropriation? Well, yes, it is. Was it exploitative? Yes, it is. I said it in the video. But I don't think that cultural appropriation is a bad thing anyway. I think there's another word you could use for cultural appropriation, and it's called peace. It's the thing that binds us all together and stops us fighting. So let's celebrate British rock music. Let's have a little giggle at these middle-class white British people singing about stuff that they can't possibly understand, and understand that that appropriation of that could be exactly the same way as many of you will now be calling all the people that you hate out there a bit of a Gareth. Thanks for watching this video. I'll see you on the next one. Stick a like on it, subscribe. I've got a Patreon, free members obviously, and paid up members. You can also put some money in my PayPal tip jar. You could become a member here and watch my videos before they come out, and get access to a whole bunch of exclusive videos as well. You could go over to my Substack and register there and see some podcasts and all sorts of stuff, or you could go and subscribe to my Bandcamp. There is many ways you can support me, but the main way you support me is to keep watching the videos, which is the thing I'm the most grateful for, and I am very much so. I thank you, especially these more esoteric ones. This is really what I live for, is to be able to switch the camera on and go into something like this and just think about an idea and not have to worry about top 10s or who's overrated or who's a silly fool or this and that, you know. So those of you watching this one, thanks for watching Philosophy Sunday. The job is done. I'll see you on the next video.